There we go. This program is being recorded and will consist of a presentation with Q&A at the end. Feel free to put your questions in the chat, and also you'll be able to say them out loud at the end. So I want to introduce our speaker. Russ Lopez is the author of 6 nonfiction books, including The Hub of the Gay Universe, an LGBTQ history of Boston, Provincetown, and beyond. Dozens of his short stories and other works have been published in various reviews and journals, including the Journal of the American Medical Association. Originally from California, with degrees from Stanford, Harvard, and Boston University, Russ lives in Boston and Provincetown. We are pleased to welcome Russ Lopez.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Becky for inviting me. I actually very much am excited by the research and the stories and the people I discovered in doing this research. So I'm very enthusiastic about this. Very enthusiastic about the book. So my first task is to share my screen here, if I could figure out a way to do that. Oh, there we go. Hopefully this work. Well, who knows? So far, everything's fine. My grandmother used to always say that computers had souls and personalities, that they could always know when you were dependent upon them, because that's when they knew they could mess up and really make maximum effort against you. But hopefully the technology will hold tonight. So my book was The Hub of the Gay Universe, as Becky said. It comes from, the old line that Boston was the hub of the universe. And I thought it was a great way of sort of centering Boston in the greater US queer history, LGBTQ history, whatever. One of the things that prompted me, I already written several history-related books, and I read a book on the struggle for same-sex marriage that was written by somebody someplace. And you would think in a book like that, Massachusetts and all the folks in Massachusetts who fought so hard for same-sex marriage would have a prominent place. However, in this history of that effort that culminated in the Supreme Court cases, Massachusetts had only had about maybe a paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs at the most, mentioned in the entire book. We were much more secondary to San Francisco and New York and Washington and Dallas and Chicago. And I'm going like, wait a second, we did it first. And there's a feeling among a lot of folks in the community that, elsewhere, that, Boston is sort of just full of, stuck up people. Massachusetts is just, in its own little world. So I really wanted to highlight that we were central to the history of LGBTQ people in this country, and sort of show that we've always been here, and as much as anybody else or any other group of people. And I think I did that pretty well, but you'll be the judge of that. Along the way, I learned a lot of irrelevant things, which I will spare you mostly. This is a picture of Cotton Mather. All sorts of things. The beauty of writing history, of reading history, is that you sort of learn things that you never would have thought you learned. Like, for example, how the Puritans, a name sort of associated with the most conservative of religions and personal practices, became today's, Unitarians and Congregationalists, two of the most liberal Protestant denominations in the country. So, how did that happen? It was a great story. I learned a lot about religion. I had to read a lot about Wellesley College and how it was founded. And originally, it was always, to educate women, but originally they didn't have any female professors. And then suddenly they came, oh, wow, we really should promote female professors and what that meant to later history. I had to learn about how the Great General Court, sorry to say, misspelled it here, how that worked in terms of looking at the marriage issue. So a lot of things, which I will spare you of. But just to know that there's a lot more, when you start studying history, a lot more things than you might imagine. This is a picture of a woman named Deborah Gannett. She's famous because she, during the American Revolution, she dressed up as a man and fought for the um, rebels, I guess you'd say, the patriots, the what became the United States folks against the British, and did that for several years. And then after that, she had a stage career. Hence the picture where she would march around and show people why she was such a great soldier. But what that really tells you back in 1776, and as you'll see in another minute here, is that one of the interesting things about LGBTQ people is that they've existed for since the beginning of this country, since the beginning of European settlement. There's a lot of evidence that some Native American tribes and nations were very supportive of what we would call LGBTQ things. Some were not. We don't really have any real evidence of what the natives of Massachusetts thought about this, so I didn't even include it because I don't think it's relevant. If you say that the Cherokee say this, it has no meaning to me, at least, that the Massachusetts or the Pequot Indians say that, because it'd be like saying, well, because the Bulgarians like something, people in Sweden should like the same thing. It just there's just no connection. So we really don't have any evidence. That was a problem in writing this book for the most part, is that I was sort of restricted by what I could find in historical records. And as you could imagine, wealthy people, male people, white people were much more likely to leave things behind. Harvard men love to write things in their memoirs, in their diaries and letters. Other folks just didn't get their chance to be as productive and as to sort of tell their stories. So inequality, income inequality, gender inequality, all the other inequalities, race inequalities, sort of transmit beyond the grave in a sense. But anyway, so people have always challenged sex and gender norms, as you'll see from the very beginning that the Pilgrims and the Puritans first arrived. But what's also interesting, to me at least, was that tolerance and acceptance also varied over times. There were periods of time where there was almost a golden age for lesbians and gay men, as long as they were wealthy and white and Protestant. But there was a time when folks were relatively accepted and tolerated and welcomed, and then those times also ended. So it really tells you that tolerance and acceptance are choices that societies and people of them make. The other thing I think is important is that, particularly when I talk to usually younger people, is that, even under some of the most adverse conditions, people still had a good time, right? They could, it wasn't, before Stonewall, it wasn't a time of horrible, everybody just walked around in sadness and depression and never smiled and never laughed and never danced. That even under adversity, people sort of assert themselves, they assert their humanity. And I think that's very important to understand, that in bad times, you can survive and even have some good memories in the midst of those horrible times. Some of the more interesting things is again, there's always people challenging what mainstream folks thought about LGBTQ people. This is a picture of a place in Boston on Beacon Hill, 105 Revere Street, at the corner of Charles and Revere Street. And you'll hear more about this later, but in the midst of a terrible wave of crackdowns on gay men during World War I, there was a party held in this, a series of parties held in an apartment in this building, where we know what happened because there were agents, there were police there, undercover police, recording everything. But people were laughing and dancing and drinking, and and even they were also complaining about the repression and saying we need to organize to stop it. So even in the worst of times, and you'll hear more about the World War I and why it was one of the worst of times, even in those really bad times, people kept on living, and people thought, we got to figure out a way to oppose this. We got to work together to sort of make the world a better place. And I think that's a lesson for maybe the times today. So everything sort of really begins with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, at least as far as you don't really have anything beyond um, any records for that before. Um, and just because one of the things you sort of realize is just because they have fines and if no one was cross-dressing and men only dressed the way men were supposed to dress and women only dressed the way women were supposed to dress, you wouldn't have laws against it. But the fact of the matter is, you did have laws against it, and in the judicial records of the Plymouth colony, more than in the Massachusetts colony, you find constantly people being fined for not dressing proper. And they also had very strict ideas about what folks were supposed to do. This is a picture of a Maribel, which is actually in Quincy, Mass. And there was a guy there named Thomas Morton, who this was not an official colony. It was sort of in the no man's land between Massachusetts colony and Plymouth colony. And this guy started his own little settlement where he started trading with the Indians, giving them guns and giving them alcohol. And they were having a really blast of a time. So eventually, the Pilgrim forces in Plymouth colony went after him and arrested him and sent him back in chains to England. And they also, probably in the first episode of gay baiting in the United States, they accused him of fostering same-sex activity. At the same time, they also accused him of fostering wanton women. So a little bit of a disconnect between what they were saying. But this is the kind of thing you find from the very beginning. This is in the 1630s, that 1620s, that from the very beginning of time in Massachusetts, you had people doing things that, sort of undercut what we would have thought would be a very whatever kind of society. One of the more interesting things is the whole position of sodomy and the death penalty. And you probably heard that same-sex relations between people were punishable by death. However, it wasn't quite that simple. First of all, the early colonists, in their wisdom, actually even the middle, up until the 19th century, the powers that be in Massachusetts couldn't conceive that women would have sex with other women, that it was only something men did with men. So technically, a woman couldn't have sex with another woman illegally, because they couldn't even think about that. And even for men, the sodomy laws were actually only applied to actual anal penetrative sex. So just anything short of that did not constitute sodomy. And for that, one of the very interesting reasons that no one was ever put to death for sodomy in Massachusetts. Now, remember, at this time, in other places, I think Virginia colony probably hanged or burned or whatever, well over 100 men for sodomy. And in England, I think they were probably doing that maybe every week. There was draconian laws against sodomy in London, for example, that were enforced all the time. And it wasn't that Massachusetts wasn't putting people to death all the time anyway. I mean, if you were a Quaker, if you were a Baptist, if you were just a non-believer, they would, either send you away or, exile you or kill you. I mean, they would put you in Boston Common and hang you. So, but they never did it for sodomy. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that under English common law, which is the basis for ours, is that you need two people to provide firsthand evidence to put somebody to death. So unless both people who were involved, or a whole group of people ran into somebody, two men involved, you didn't really ever have two witnesses. And the other piece is that up until really the late 19th century, up until the 1860s, 1870s, maybe later 1890s, there was no concept of people being gay as being gay. That people might do sinful acts, but that didn't mean you were necessarily a gay person. You did, and matter of fact, they thought that anybody could do sinful acts, so everybody was a sinner. So there were no gay people in a sense. Um, and this sort of weird position of how the law treated gay people lasted for a very long time. Because of all the civil wars in England. I don't know if you're familiar with that one or not. You know, there was Charles the First and Charles the Second, and all these, and in between there were the Oliver Cromwell and all these other folks. Every time the government changed in England, they revoked all the colonial charters. They had to do new ones and then pass a whole new legal code. So Massachusetts, before Massachusetts and Plymouth and then Maine colony were all combined, and even afterwards, they kept having to redo all their laws. So they kept having to say, yes, sodomy was punishable by death, but they never did it, even though in other places they were doing it all the time. For the most part, also, cross-dressing itself wasn't illegal per se. And that it was just considered disorderly conduct. And disorderly conduct is a great thing if you're a policeman, because it's anything a policeman decides it is. I think any of you read the news today in New York City or read Los Angeles with Senator Padilla. You'll notice that we're still doing that. Anything that they don't like, powers to be, they'll consider obstructive justice or basically disorderly conduct. And in Massachusetts, it was different than in other places, and this will have an effect along the whole history of Massachusetts. It was never illegal to be gay. In New York City, for example, bars couldn't even serve liquor, a drink, to anybody who was thought to be gay. In California, if they thought you were gay, you could be locked up just for that. In Massachusetts, that was never the case. So it was never illegal to have a bar that served gay people, for example. And it was never just being gay that would get you locked up. Now, there were crackdowns, and anybody who was slightly considered to be suspect might get arrested for disorderly conduct throughout the next 300 years. But in and of itself, there was a certain amount of freedom that wasn't available in the rest of the United States. So I'm only giving you the highlights. This is a picture from Beacon Hill of Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields. Annie Fields was the widow of the guy who founded Ticknor and Fields, the great publishing house in Boston, and Jewett was a famous writer and poet. And they lived openly on Beacon Hill and invited the most Brahmin of the Brahmins to their house, and no one ever seemed to care. There was this strange period of time when you could be pretty much out there as long as you weren't seen as threatening or the status quo or anything. And it lasted for almost 40 years. And it wasn't perfect. People still left because they felt they couldn't be themselves. There was a bunch of people went to England, for example. Some people went to France and Italy. But as long as you didn't, sort of say anybody that they had to actually confront you as being gay, you and your significant other, or your partner, or you want to call it, would be considered to be, socially acceptable. Now that was very, very limited to a certain group of people. You had to be white, wealthy, and Protestant. There was one woman who was Catholic, for example, and she tried to be part of this group, and she was shunned because she was Catholic, not because she was a lesbian. So these folks were everywhere. There's Isabel Stewart Gardner had her friends. She used to like to go to see plays at the symphony with these two men who lived up in Gloucester, and A. Piatt Andrew and Henry David Sleeper. And, they were quite they accompanied her everywhere, those years after her husband died. Piatt actually went on to become a congressman. He was I think like a 6-term congressman before he passed away of a heart attack while in office. So these folks were quite prominent. And during this time, particularly at Wellesley and at Smith and other places where there were a group of college educated, very ambitious women who pretty much dedicated their lives to each other and created really wonderful things. You're probably all familiar with the song America the Beautiful. That was written by a woman named Catherine Lee Bates. And she was in a Boston marriage, as you were, with Catherine Corman, for example. So these women were quite prominent, quite well accepted. So you might want to know why this ended. A couple things happened. One was World War One, and as you'll see, there was this general crackdown, mostly pushed on Massachusetts by outside forces. But also there was a new change in sort of, this was not quite Freud, this was before his time, but there was a new set of ideas that people were gay and lesbian. I mean, there was even an article, a book called When Germans Invented Homosexuality, is that a group of German social scientists and philosophers and others, doctors, sort of came with this idea that gay people were gay. It wasn't just something that otherwise indistinguishable people did certain activities, but people did things because they thought they were different or acted different or felt different. They were fundamentally different. And it was also, women also had the problem is that suddenly people discovered that women could be sexual beings. And so one reason why Boston marriages between women were so accepted was that no one thought that these women would actually be having sex with each other. And then when people began to realize that, that kind of helped also change. So there was a time when there was this wonderful acceptance. And I'd like to think that, let's say World War One didn't happen, and all these things I'll tell you about in a minute didn't happen. We really could have started broadening who could be accepted, right? That maybe you didn't have to be just white. You could be Black or Latino or Asian. Maybe you didn't have to be wealthy. Maybe middle class folks could start being, as open like this. Maybe you didn't have to be Protestant. You could be Jewish or Catholic, right? You can imagine an alternative world, right, where we went from this sort of small group of people who could do what they wanted, and everybody winked and said that didn't care about it, to a broader world where the acceptance went to everybody in the community. It didn't happen. It didn't happen at all. So there were three things that happened sort of at the end of World War One. One was that the Navy, the US Navy, nationally decided to crack down on vice in cities. They thought that, and that was part of the war effort, that vice districts were hurting, sailors were hurting soldiers, that it was necessary to stop the whole thing. And in city after city, you read about how either the Navy themselves or like in Boston, they told the police commissioner either he does it or they will come and do it themselves, that there needs to be stopping of this. So over a series of several weeks, the police arrested hundreds and hundreds of men. And actually, we now know the sort of the parameters of where gay men hung out in those days, because you could actually trace the arrest by a police district. The sudden thing that any man on the street who didn't look like they were upstanding, moral, straight citizens was arrested. Disorderly conduct again. At the same time, or right thereafter, there was this purge at Harvard. A undergraduate young man committed suicide for a variety of reasons, and his brother went to the powers that be and caused this big purge where ended up like 7 or 8 students were expelled. One committed suicide. It was quite the scandal, and it kind of sort of told there was sort of a young student gay underground, you might say, across Boston, and it told everybody to go back into the closet. And the final thing was a scandal at the Newport, Rhode Island naval base, where somebody complained about homosexual activity. And then very controversial was the Navy paid volunteer. Well, they paid men who volunteered to go undercover to expose other men. So and some of these men ended up having sex with other men on the dime of the Navy. And about a dozen men were put into solitary confinement and dishonorably discharged because of that. So all that really kind of ended. And that was going on nationally as well. As I think that by the end of that, there was pretty much a national sort of lockdown of gay, lesbian, certainly trans people, anybody who challenged the sexual standards that lasted from about, let's say, 1917 to 1969. So 60 years really of horrible, horrible repression. And that's really what we think of as sort of what was the norm before our time. But it really wasn't. That was much more of a bad time than even before. I mean, this was gay people. There was the lavender scare, and people began to think that gay people were soft on communism and whatnot. So these were very, very bad years. To some extent, they haven't ended. I mean, we sort of no longer have people purged from the State Department because they're gay. But that there's still sort of in certain places, it's still hard to get jobs, and there's still not employment protections everywhere. By the probably early 80s, there was the AIDS years, which again were very bad times, and there's ongoing violence against trans women. This is a woman, picture of a woman named Rita Hester, who was brutally murdered in Brighton, and they never found out who did it. But as you'll see in a moment, her memory sparked a national movement. What the history also tells you is that there were always these sort of networks of people, and I think that's one reason why gay people and LGBTQ people in the 50s were thought about as being, I think, suspect, because it was a network of people that was outside official channels, right? In Boston, again, it was never illegal to be gay. There were, from the moment they lifted the restrictions on alcohol sales. Was it 1930? I'm a historian, it's bad with dates. I think it was repealed in 33, 34. But at that moment, there were gay bars in Boston. And though there was oftentimes police harassment, they would famously come into a place, not ask everybody for IDs. And as you handed them your ID, you also handed them a couple dollars to bribe them. And if you didn't have an ID, you'd be taken down. If the police found people, same-sex people dancing, they would break up the place. But if they walked into a place and people were just drinking and nothing was going on, they didn't do mass arrests like they did in other cities. They didn't bust up the places like they did in other cities. So Massachusetts, all the way out to Pioneer Valley and beyond, had these networks of folks. Sometimes they were bad. I mean, they were bad for people, because if one person got arrested, they would use that to sort of try to get them to turn evidence against other folks. But for the most part, they actually provided people with resilience. And that house, again, back in that I showed you that on Revere Street, it was a guy named Lee Porter was the renter there, and he was having these parties where all these folks were coming in, and somehow it got in that there had been a couple sailors had been there. So then that got the naval police again during World War I to go in there. So they went in there. They recorded people, dancing with each other. Somebody was playing the piano, and they were, they had some special cocktails. And some guy at one point came out with all these feathered headdress and a feathered boa, even back in 1918, right? And did a little dance and everything else. And at one point, they were all talking about the crackdown was going on in the streets. And, they was saying, well, what we need to do is get together and we need to fight this thing. So there really was this, there were bad times, but, you could look back and say there were things that really supported people. And there were little things too that just are just so Bostonian. And I put this picture from the public garden in Boston, because one guy wrote a sort of a tell-all it was sort of a manifesto about how there shouldn't be any police harassment of gay people in 1944. Right before he got shipped out overseas, he was stationed in Boston, and he talked about how people who like to go cruising in the public garden wouldn't talk to the people who like to go cruising in the common. And nothing to me says Boston like that, right? We got this people over here who think they're better than those people, and those people over there think they're better than those people, right? So even gay people were like that. You know, they might have been gay, queer, whatever you want, but they were Bostonians from the beginning. The other interesting thing is that Boston produced a lot of great activists and a lot of great victories. There was a newspaper called Gay Community News that was published out of Boston, and the people who worked on it when there was a point in the 90s where almost every national gay organization had somebody who had been in Boston or in one of the Amherst or Smith in the central part of the state, and had that connection to Massachusetts and ran almost the entire country's sort of network of LGBTQ groups. And that's just one of the things we did. I mean, obviously, marriage started here. And, you know, certainly I suspect it would have happened anyway. But the fact that it happened here and we sort of, you know, provided a spark at a time when marriage was being defeated so many other places, I think is a tribute to what happened here in our state. And I showed you the Rita Hester picture. She was very well loved, very much an influential person, and her murder, along with the murder of other trans women, really struck people hard. And so now every year, it was started in her memory, but now it's really for all the trans women. Far too many trans women who are victims of violence. We now have Trans Day of Remembrance for those folks. So it's another thing that's maybe that's not the best thing in the world, but at least again, as a reaction to repression, we sort of started here. And again, we've always been a little different here. Bars could serve LGBTQ people. You never would have had a Stonewall type event because that sort of thing of closing down a bar didn't happen here. Again, they were harassed, but never shut down. Our sodomy laws, they actually got rid of them fairly interestingly, and public sex laws. What they did was they didn't quite bounce around the acts themselves, but they just kept slicing off it, made it harder and harder to enforce them. So example, with public sex laws, not that I'm encouraging anybody to do anything unseemly that might scare horses or anything. But you know, it's first the courts noted that the public sex laws as applied to same-sex activity had to be the same as for male-female activity. So that was a big thing, because you can always think about, you know, if two teenagers are necking in a car, no one gets arrested. But if two men are necking in a car, then they would be, right? So the court said no to that. And then they said, well, you know, if you're in a car, you're actually trying to be private, so that doesn't count. So they kept doing little things like that to whittle things away. The courts were very forward thinking here from the beginning. And again, we were the first to have the same-sex marriage. So I'm going to stop there. I'll give you a few highlights of our history here. This is my shameless plug here for my book. It's available Amazon, bookshop.com, virtually any place books are sold. And I have a website, and that's my Twitter handle. I need to update that since no one really uses Twitter anymore. But thanks. So let's go to questions rather than me talking.
Thank you, Russ.
Share.
If people want to raise their hands and they can ask questions out loud, or if you want to put them in the chat, then that would be great too. I had a question, Russ. I was curious if you can talk about the types of sources that you used for your research on the book.
Yeah, I really went everywhere I could, you know, and one of the greatest things about doing research is you could go, you could go anywhere. So I did things like I went down to New York, and Lincoln Kirstein, whose father was the owner of Filene's, and he went on to found the New York City Ballet. um, with George Ballantyne. He had a diary of his time when he was a Bostonian. He lived in Kenmore Square, and he had a diary of his time here. So I got to go read his diary, the little things like that. I I was in, I went to Amherst for some of the things. A lot of university libraries have things. There were a lot of things at the Boston Athenaeum, and Historic New England also had a lot of great things. So it just the places you could go for research, the things you could do, is really the most rewarding thing about writing a history book. If anybody is so crazy, you have to do it. It's a labor. It took me like 5 years to get all this done, but it was so exciting. I was just so lucky that I could do these things and go Yale Library and Harvard libraries and all sorts of other things. If you're a nerd like me, going to a library and going through these files and looking at things and reading people's original papers, right? It's just absolutely marvelous, absolutely wonderful.
I might be a nerd like you. Do you have anything that you're currently working on?
I actually going to have out in March something called Provincetown Stories. It's a series of short stories set in Provincetown. They're all fiction. My attorney said to say that any resemblance to people, places, or events is purely coincidental. So it just happens to be a little Portuguese fishing village slash Irish colony slash resort that's on Cape Cod Bay, right? But that's coming out in March. And that's like the biggest thing. I'm also working on an update, sort of in novel form of the importance of being earnest, setting it today. Because if you have people impersonating other people, for those of you who know the story, right? What better way to do it than catfishing people's photos on the internet? You really can have fun with it. So I'm busy.
Can you tell us what maybe the most interesting or shocking fact that you learned was in your research?
Well, um, I did a, I should say that my, I came into history by way of urban history. And I have my Harvard degree is actually a master's in city planning, and my BU degree is a degree in public health, in environmental health. And um, I started writing about the interplay between the built environment and health outcomes. Like if you have a supermarket in your zip code, your risk of being overweight or obese drops by about 10%, for example. And Massachusetts was a great place to do that sort of research because you have wealthy towns without grocery stores and you have poor towns with grocery stores. So anyway, it was a anyway, that's my background. I really went against the rules of epidemiology. I tried to figure out what percentage of gay men died of AIDS in between 1979 and 96. And violating every rule because you really don't know the denominator or the numerator. But best as I can figure out is about 1 out of 10 died. 10% of men who would have been, let's say, between the ages of 20 and 60 during those years, most likely to get AIDS, if anybody died of it. Now, that might not sound very much, but to me, it was horrifying as a person who lived through all that. But also, I mean, you compare it to, say, the percentage of French men who died during World War I, for example, it's higher. So it really represents one of the largest peacetime rates of death, certainly in the United States, ever. And so in the sort of developed world, probably one of the greatest, sort of a famine or something, really one of the greatest, literally decimation of a community. And that to me really shocks me. I think the best thing really was the fun people had, even in the 50s, right? It gave you this your family would disown you. You might lose your job. You're still worried about the police, um, um, even though you probably wouldn't be arrested. But people would go around and just carouse, and this they would love it, and they would look forward to it, and it'd be and I guess I didn't know this that in Massachusetts the liquor laws were such that Saturday night places had to close at midnight because they couldn't be open on Sundays. They couldn't serve alcohol after midnight, and people would just up until midnight on Saturday was be having a blast, and that was kind of reassuring to me at least. Um, I see there's a question about how did P-Town become a location and gathering place for gay folks. And that's us. I didn't talk much about P-Town, but that's a fascinating topic. Um, First of all, it was known in the 1870s as a place for women to go take painting classes. So you have all these young women away from any kind of supervision there. And they didn't always behave. Let's put it that way, or to behave as whatever it did. So that was the start of it. But the real beginning of it as a wild destination happened because of World War I, when all the folks who would go from Greenwich Village to Paris for the summer couldn't go to Europe at all, and so they all decided to go to P-Town. And the straight people actually had more wild times than the gay people, but the gay people quickly learned how to catch up with the whole thing. And from then, the party never stopped. Actually, it just kept going longer and longer. It's actually, again, it's one of the things I wanted to write in the book, even for the world at large, is that there were always gay, lesbian, queer people, even if we didn't call them that, even if they didn't see themselves as that. They always existed here. They were always part of the fabric of Massachusetts life. And we weren't newcomers, right? We're sort of old timers, and old and established sort of place, for people and places.
So give people about another 15 seconds here if you have another question for Russ.
As you can tell, I get very excited about all this stuff. It really was a privilege to be able to read all this stuff, right? I mean, you think, again, writing history is like the popular history. Like, it's just one of the most privileged things you could do in this world. I'm very lucky.
All right, well, seeing no other questions, Russ, I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight. And thank you everyone for joining us. This recording will be available, and we'll get that out in the next day or two. So again, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Have a good night.